So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our new seminar series for 2025. We've called it Horizon 2025, and it's going to be all about, as you could have seen from the call, exploring the present and creatively imagining the future. And very particularly, we want to shift the focus to art and ask how art can help us creatively imagine the future. Although the philosophers and academics among us, me included, will probably just refer to existing artworks like movies and that kind of thing, I'm very happy to say that some of our presenters will present and discuss their own original artwork. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm also excited to say that our program at the moment is completely full for the entire year. So it's clearly an exciting topic that has grabbed lots of people. And we'll be hearing from some of our core regulars and seeing some new faces, which is exciting. So I'm going to kick off by unpacking some of the complexity of the concept of the future. And I'm going to try to make sense of what Zizek means by the future when he asks what lies ahead when there is no future. Before I do this, though, I should probably introduce myself. So I am Andrea Hurst, a professor of philosophy, and I hold a research chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa. That's what the acronym Iscia stands for. And I would like to just mention that there are two co-hosts to the seminar. You'll meet them in due course. Gary Kukamur and Emma Hay, both are postdoctoral fellows of the chair. So yeah, we will introduce them at some point, but perhaps we can just dive straight in. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Apologies for that. Let's play that from the start. There we go. Okay, so just yell or let me know if there's any trouble seeing the pictures. That will keep you entertained while I rattle on philosophically.
We can see it.
Awesome. Thanks, Vulundlela. Okay, so Zizek's proclamation, too late to awaken, and his question, what lies ahead when there is no future, they're meant to be provocative, and their interpretation really depends on what you understand by the future, which turns out to be quite manifold and complex. So I'm actually going to start by looking at a movie, if I can move it on, there we go. The Substance, which can be read as a parable that enacts quite a straightforward face value interpretation of Zizek's proclamation. And the film's answer to his question is quite unequivocal. What lies ahead is monstrous decadence and death. In the same sense that you might tell an injured dancer, there's no future for you as a ballerina. The film is saying that there is no future for its main character, Elizabeth. And I'm going to use Elizabeth as an analogy for humanity at large. Okay, so in the movie, Demi Moore plays Elizabeth Sparkle, a celebrated Hollywood star hosting a fitness show for daytime TV. And on turning 50, Elizabeth's show is cancelled to make way for someone younger. She's devastated by the prospect of this living death outside of the limelight. And so she resorts to a black market drug, the Substance. This promises her a chance to relive and enhance her glory days because it enables her to split into two bodies. So in the duplicate or avatar, She can incarnate her ideal self, her supposedly better self. I'm not going to critique the kind of convoluted, sense-defying conditions of this kind of miraculous transformation. The film's significance for me, or for us, for the seminar, lies in its potency as a parable of one of the meanings, at least, of the future. Elizabeth alternates between her enhanced ideal body self, named Sue, and her original body self, the Matrix. Sue enjoys 1 week of active, vibrant life, while the Matrix lies inert, sustained by this mandatory dose of nutrition. And Sue's existence depends on a daily extraction of this life-giving fluid from the Matrix. Weekly, though, once a week, Elizabeth must swap bodies to replenish herself. So this ostensibly balanced symbiosis between original and ideal self, of course, inevitably, soon unravels. And it gives rise to one of the film's more, I think, thought-provoking aspects, a critical commentary on this congenital human dissatisfaction and self-destructive tendencies. I mean, typically, we're almost automatically equate a better self with youth and physical allure and sex appeal. And we wouldn't think of it as a kind of kinder, older, more mature, more loving, wiser, more intelligent, more creative. And Elizabeth initially kind of revels in these kind of hedonistic pleasures of her younger idealized self, but she soon enough discovers the flaws in this self-idealization as a kind of a hot young sex pot. Youthful self-centeredness leads Sue to crave more than her allotted share of life. This is inevitable, isn't it? Even the ideal remains dissatisfied, driven by the desire for more hedonistic pleasure. So nothing urgent like, a cure for cancer. Sue starts tampering with this mandatory fluid exchange so she can snatch a little bit more life. And the consequences of this are quite dire. Elizabeth wakes, sorry about that, to find her original body kind of grotesquely aged. The first time this happens, part of her hand has kind of crumpled into this grotesque ancient claw of a crone. And this, she discovers, is an irreversible consequence of her irresponsibility as Sue. And despite this, her addiction to her younger self kind of prevents her from terminating the experiment. She learns nothing about her own addictive nature, the insuperability of human dissatisfaction, or the need for self-care and empathy. Instead, this war develops between the two selves. Elizabeth is addicted to her younger, enhanced being, whose insatiable desire for more of the life she's supposed to share equally between both selves leads to this careless sacrifice of the older self. The older version wakes each time to increasingly monstrous physical decay. She's incensed with herself for the self-destructive way in which her youthful self is stealing life from her older self at the ultimate cost of the whole. But she remains kind of split between resentful hatred for her avatar and a relentless addiction to the hedonistic pleasures to be gained from being the avatar. So it's killing her, but she seems incapable of putting an end to the situation. And this rapid and violent aging that renders her original body increasingly monstrous makes it seem far too late for her to awaken. So this war between Elizabeth's two selves actually goes wildly over the top in the movie, ending in this orgy of biomedical body horror. But this shouldn't cause us to lose sight of the film's really interesting critical comment regarding the temptation to selfishly steal more than our fair share of life substance from our future selves. just for the sake of excessive hedonistic enhancements that end up doing nothing in the end to solve a congenital human dissatisfaction. Okay, so to bring this all back to Zizek, the narrative serves as a parable for humanity at large. Just as Elizabeth's actions as Sue destroy her older self and therefore the whole, so at the species level, each barrel of oil that we extract, each forest that we fell, kind of represents the draining of the planet's life-giving substance for ever more short-term pleasures and luxuries. Across the human spectrum, the refrain is constant. No matter how enhanced our lives are, we just crave more. We're ensnared by this congenital dissatisfaction and an auto-destructive selfishness and addictions to power and pleasure. So we heedlessly just leave no future worth living for our older selves. This is the core, actually, of Greta Thunberg's accusation. You are stealing our future. Zizek's proclamation suggests that, like Elizabeth, we've left it too late to awaken. We've crossed a critical threshold where the damage inflicted on our planet is irreversible. And what lies ahead is monstrosity, decay, and death. But humans have no future. There is no hope for us. So this very bleak parable offered by the substance, I think, is only one way of understanding Zizek's proclamation and answering his really unsettling question. The movie really depends on a very straightforward, common sense conception of the future as the predictable, direct, linear unfolding of what happens next from out of what's already in place. So actions in the past and present directly influence outcomes in the future. This is what you could call an economic account of the future, marked by the French word futur. Sorry if that pronunciation is really weird, it probably is. But in certain languages, and certainly in French, the concept of the future has another sense, marked actually by a different word. In French, it's avenir, which by contrast refers to a radical, unforeseeable rupture, which is discontinuous with the present, heralds the new and the unknown. It's something unimaginable to come, not just the unfolding of what can be anticipated. So given this complexity, there are conflicting ways to understand what it means to say there is no future. In the first sense, you can interpret no future as meaning, well, no avenir. In other words, radical change is impossible. There is only futur, the inexorable unfolding of kind of existing trajectories. Apocalyptic religions exemplify this mindset, perceiving our catastrophic end as our future. A secular vision of this would be reflected in this kind of existential dread related to the realization that we are kind of all hurtling towards death. And the future is out of human hands. There's no hope for a future life on Earth. So, sorry about that. Some offer a kind of story of salvation here through denying materiality, and you would exit corporeal and earthly life into a kind of future in heaven. But, you know, myths, stories, And if you don't accept the mythological stories that are offered, I don't, then apocalyptic catastrophe would be perceived as our fate. And what is left for us? Passivity, cynicism, despair. They're quite hard to resist on that view. But again, not the only view we have of the future. Futur can also, we can think of it in terms of a kind of voluntarism and responsibility. And actually the substance assumes a more voluntaristic interpretation of futur. In this view, the future as avenue is still an illusion. I mean, there's no sudden radical change. There is only the actualization of tendencies that are already in place, but there's no preordained apocalyptic path which we fated to follow. The path is still predictable. I mean, what we do now has predictable consequences for what will come. The future is in human hands. If our current actions are causing a drift towards catastrophe, our doom will be self-inflicted in the same way that Sue's actions inflicted the doom on Elizabeth. But acts of resistance and realignment, although they're constrained by existing patterns, they can redirect humanity away from disaster. So the hope offered here, though, would be tempered by skepticism about human resolve, about human will. I mean, we can act to change things, but will we? And if you're skeptical about that, well, then this presents no hope for the future at all. So then we're left with the possibility of avenue, of embracing radical openness, kind of, we might then argue, well, the preordained or even predictable future was always an illusion. There is only avenue, the radical, unforeseeable emergence of the new. We can't imagine or foresee life-changing events or inventions. They'll happen if and when, for better or for worse, we don't know. And they might save the world, they might accelerate its decline. That it's just that we don't know, and we can't know. So those are different ways of thinking about the future. So when Zizek asks what lies ahead when there is no future, the question changes depending on whether you interpret the concept as avenue or futur. What lies ahead when there is no avenue? Well, apocalypse or the slim chance of dramatic change in our will to act, which seems incredibly at the moment weak. What lies ahead when there is no futur? When we refuse to terrify ourselves with deterministic or apocalyptic or fatalistic visions? Well, uncertainty, the uncertainty of the avenue. I mean, it is a source of hope, that's certainly true, but it also seems problematic and dangerous to just passively wait for some kind of miraculous invention that would shape the future. It would kind of look like the question needs to be more complex. So what lies ahead when the future is impossible? When neither conception of the future is viable? When we're not locked into a kind of preordained path or predictable linearity, but we can't just sit around and wait for some kind of passive miracle to save us or finally destroy us. So what lies ahead when the future is impossible? I mean, the answer would have to be more complex than a choice between oppositions, a choice between, say, fatalism and human agency, or predictable continuation and like a radical miraculous break with the present. So, and Zizek rightly suggests that we should actually strive for no future, in the sense of no futur. because we do want to break free from the deterministic projections of catastrophe. And we do want to face up to an inherently obscure future as avenue. I mean, life has always been complex, and it means it will exceed us in ways that we can't imagine yet. And we have to accept that we are always still open to becoming other. And there is space for something absolutely new to come that we can't imagine yet. But it doesn't imply that we should expect unlimited possibilities. I mean, you just can't magic something out of the blue sky. The constraints and the possibilities of the present do feed into what happens in the future. And changes happen when you actively create space in present conditions for something else to happen, without knowing exactly what it'll be. So in practical terms, then, if you want to take a kind of hybrid answer to this question, we can move towards an obscure future by opening spaces for the unknown to emerge. So we'll be looking backwards, not forwards. All we can do is back away from known horrors of the present. And what are they? What are some of those? There are roughly 4 of them that Zizek lists that I think are really important to consider. The first is what he calls the safari state of mind, from a documentary called Sarajevo Safari. So during the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, wealthy foreigners, Western foreigners from UK, US, Italy, and Russia paid the Bosnian Serb army for a chance to shoot at city residents from a high place up in the surrounding hills. So these hunters experienced a perverse thrill derived from the knowledge that while anonymous and depersonalized, their victims were real. They were living, breathing humans. And in that mindset of detachment that elevates the self above ordinary abject reality, it's actually, according to Zizek, the hunters that become derealized. I mean, Zizek basically says reality itself was made part of a spectacle in which the hunter could pretend that he wasn't personally involved. And that safari state of mind, which represents kind of a deeply dangerous psychological distance, can be generalized, I think, not only to some of our world leaders, some of our executives, some of our media heroes. I think it can also be generalized to ordinary people. So it's interesting to think about in what situations we actually adopt this safari state of mind ourselves. In the substance, it's the detachment felt by the seemingly invincible sexpot Sue towards that abject older being she will become, and by extension towards all abject selves. Okay, so that's briefly one of the known horrors which we ought to be able to back away from. The second is what Zizek calls this social and political madness of contradictory extremes. And we know that with contradictory extremes, you get solutions that become problems. You get appearances that mask kind of contradictory realities. You get cures that turn out to be poisons, and nothing is what it seems. I mean, his example is, say, on the side of opposing ideological blocks shaping the global landscape. You've got religious neoconservatives, from Putin to Trump, hardline regimes in Iran, and they denounce this kind of satanic postmodern decadence. And they advocate this return to old orthodox religious traditions. And but these are laced with kind of obscenities and violences. And on the other side, you've got this politically correct liberal left that champions inclusivity and tolerance, but imposes all of these intolerant restrictions and cancel culture exclusions on people. So lots of contradictions as soon as you start thinking in terms of polarized extremes. There's lots more to worry about in those terms, but I think that's, again, very briefly, one of the known horrors that we ought to be moving away from, according to Zizek. The third, which is shared by both left and right, is this fundamental commitment to maintaining power structures that perpetuate division and violence. As Zizek notes, at a time when it's generally agreed that our very survival is under threat for ecological reasons, and when everything we are doing should be subordinated to cope with the really completely real ongoing threats posed by viruses and heat waves and droughts and famines and floods, our prime political concern remains war and power, with all of these proxy conflicts edging humanity closer and closer to a third world war. And that can only, as he says, shorten our collective path to suicide. So power is another known horror we ought to be walking or moving, backing away from. And the last one is consumer culture. It's a pacifying mass kind of activity, a mind-numbing array of consumer goods in aisle after aisle after aisle, and this diverts attention from urgent ecological and social issues. So walking away from disengagement and polarization, power and consumption would go a long way to disrupt the drift towards catastrophe and open possibilities for something new and unforeseeable to emerge. So Zizek says hope lies in acting as if the catastrophe we want to prevent is actually already there. And then moving into a kind of an emergency mode of being, which fully accepts the fact that we live on spaceship Earth. And this imposes the task of universal solidarity and cooperation among all human communities. So in the substance, Elizabeth's hope for a decent life as an older version of herself would lie in a successful appeal to her gorgeous younger self to recognize that they're in it together. And that phrase, remember you are one, is repeated regularly in the movie. Sue is kind of called upon to take account of the future abject being she will become and sacrifice a bit of her current pleasure and self-enhancement to improve the life experience of that being. She wasn't willing to do it. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready for these life-changing shifts? Personally, I don't think so. So where do you turn when the future feels hopeless? I'm taking to heart the final message of another movie, Don't Look Up, which basically in that final image is saying, find whatever beauty, joy, love, laughter, kindness, creativity, or caring you can right now in the present. Maybe if every action contributes to the story of what is to come, and every event holds the potential for this wild transformation, then creating the conditions for these values in the present is not a trivial act. Each act opens a space for something else to happen, even while keeping the focus on the present. And that is it. That's a very that is as far as I can move towards somehow looking at the future in an optimistic way. So thanks for listening. And yeah, it would be very nice to hear your questions. I'm going to stop sharing if I can and open up the space for people to chat. Not quite sure how to do it, except I think maybe either just put your video on and we'll open up, or stick up your hand. That would be. Brilliant, Leila. Hi, you are. Oh, yes.
Okay, so thank you, Andrea. I love movies. I'll get the ball rolling. There were so many things that were coming to mind when you were talking. And maybe off the bat, I think that there's a strong correlation between a lot of the zeitgeist around disaster movies that have come out in the last maybe 10 years or so. And I'm thinking things like Lars von Trier's sort of work in terms of Melancholia and Antichrist and all the rest of them. And this is one of the first sort of movies that takes a very uh, personal, existential sort of look, or physical look at at human body as standing in for that collapse of humanity, I suppose. And I find that very exciting. I was making notes as you were going along, and something that I'd watched recently made me think about this question of looking forward. I've got so many anecdotes, but looking forward to a future and standing on a horizon and all the rest of it. And I enjoyed the parallel, or at least explanation of in the linguistic terms of futur and the linearity of actions in the past and present influencing the future, and then avenir sort of being the radical changes of the now and things. And I've been following this very interesting discourse on linguistics, and it's between Noam Chomsky and this other dude, I can't remember. And there's a group in the in South America called the Piraha, and their language is being sort of studied because it doesn't seem to contain any recursions. In the same way that we would say John opened the door. One would say, or you would hear it from somebody else. Peter said John opened the door. So there's no sort of past way of thinking. They live in a very present way of speaking. I am. I am fisherman. And man will not come back. Man has no fish when he comes back. And it's a very strange debate, because in that there's a sense of the present. There's no need for wanting more. There's no need for a sense of we need to build bigger houses. We need to go and have a McDonald's on the corner. There's a very much cultural, linguistic sense. I think they understand that the future happens if they don't get fish, but there's no sense of dread when it comes to how they express that. And so for me, it's sort of it got me thinking about some of what you were saying is about the sense of living in a very present moment, not being static in that present moment, but being aware. And the last anecdote I would finish with is this, you used it quite nicely in terms of backing away from the horrors. Made me think of the tradition of backing in and out of doorways, not to bring evil with you, rather than walking forwards through a doorway. And I'll leave it there with those sorts of thoughts. But I like the linguistic sort of thought of maybe we're trapped within the language of our expression that leads us to think future in some ways. I hope I've made some sense for you to kind of make a comment to to that?
Yeah, thanks, Vulindlela. I think the language thing is really interesting. Do you think that the language reflects something that we do, or the language produces what we do? Maybe it's not an either or, because it seems rather hard to think about a world culture that would mimic a culture that doesn't really think too hard about the future, but exists in the present. But at the same time, isn't that what, in a way, the answer seems to be? That you produce a wonderful present, because from that, something may emerge that would actually enable a different future, a better future, maybe. Because it's tricky, hey, because future does come out of what you do now, but it doesn't come out directly from what you do now. There's always that chance that something wacky could actually happen. But you can't wait for that chance. You can't hope for or expect that chance. So
Yeah. I think it also it also comes across in the, so coming back to that linguistic thing, I think that if we do think linguistically or perhaps communicatively, like how we communicate our needs and our wants, perhaps there is something about how we communicate those needs. Something that comes to mind is Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer over a Sea of Fog. And I don't know if anyone has seen that painting of the lonely man standing on a rocky outcrop, looking
it's always a
over.
Nietzsche picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very much looking out into the great beyond, but there's this real tension between the beyond and the trepidation, and at the same time, this acceptance of what is happening and could happen as part of nature, as part of human, and that relationship, that tension that is there. And I think we lose sight in all the examples that you gave, we lose sight of that connection between the nature, the way we communicate our relationship with nature, the way we communicate our needs from nature, and the way we communicate our needs from each other. So I think the language thing really does kind of get to me.
Thank you.
Quite,
Yeah. It's something definitely to think about further as we progress through the year. Language being an art as well. Yeah. Let's get a few more voices into the conversation. Richard, would you like to speak to your question that's on the chat?
He's turning everything on there. Yeah, just saying that the substance reminds me of Dorian Gray, the picture of Dorian Gray, where he can do, where he sells his soul to the devil or whatever, and he can do whatever he wants, and he has a portrait, and the portrait slowly becomes this horrible monster, and he has to look at it every day, yeah, it just reminds me of that. And the other comment there, but yeah, also Jekyll and Hyde and so things like that. Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, that would be interesting. I haven't read The Portrait of Dorian Gray, but I've heard it mentioned now a couple of times in this context, and it's definitely a read that I am going to put on my list.
But you haven't read Dorian Gray? My goodness me, Andrea.
I know, I'm afraid. I know. It's a terrible what shall we call it?
So many books to read and not enough time.
I know.
Yeah.
And if you have to read all these jolly philosophy books, then literature kind of gets swept out the window. But yes. Okay, so yes, I think it is an interesting book to, well, it seems like it would be an interesting book to look at. So yeah. Can you explain a tiny bit about, just very briefly about, I mean, why does his picture become a monster?
Well, it's similar to Elizabeth. Okay, so he's I can't exactly remember the story, but he sells his soul to the devil, and he stays young forever.
Okay.
He's
Okay.
got a portrait of himself, and the portrait ages, and it eventually turns into this hideous monster, exactly like Elizabeth. Yeah,
Mm,
you know,
mm,
and
mm.
and he goes to the portrait every day, and he looks at it, and it gradually becomes this horrible thing, and he's caught in, you know, this existential crisis, you know, which
Okay. Interesting.
it's
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, very ageist, both the movie and the way that you've described this thing. I mean, you know, as if aging is one of the great horrors of existence.
That's it, yes. Yeah.
Which is not, I mean, it is, it's one of our existential terrors, but it's quite a strange one, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, Belinda maybe, and then Alex. I think that's the order in which I saw things come up. So,
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, it's Belinda here. Yeah, I'm not going to add too much. Just again, to me, it's a revision of a lot of the themes that come out of Gothic literature. So Oscar Wilde, Jekyll and Hyde, Dracula, the how we manifest monsters as a means to deal with the monstrousness in ourselves, which is a very, very kind of a Gothic theme. And yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of interesting, kind of explorations to do there, but I don't think this is new. I think it's a ongoing interesting theme that you find in literature and in art. And certainly the Gothic comes to mind for me. Thank you for a lovely series. I'm looking forward to it.
okay, thanks, Belinda. The interesting thing about the substance is that the monstrosity is the future that we are creating for ourselves because of the hedonistic way in which we desire too much now for our own pleasures. I think that's the analogy that I would like to draw with regard to the future and monstrosity. But it is a very, as I said, a very common sense way of thinking about the future, that everything we do now, all the, extractive and uncaring and heedless actions that we take now are going to create a monstrous future for us. In fact, it means we have no future. But yeah, the question is that really true? And if it isn't true, of course, we don't know what the future is. So maybe something completely unimagined will happen, and that's going to actually change that trajectory of moving towards a monstrous future for us now. Yeah, so it's really a difficult position that we're in now to try and figure out, are we actually creating, well, we know that we are creating a monstrous future for ourselves environmentally, but do we really? Anyway, okay, but thank you. Yeah. So the theme of the monster is definitely in our minds, and that monster is us, which is, I think, partly what some of these novels are talking about. Alex.
Hi, Andrea. Sorry. Thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. And it's just wonderful to be in this seminar series again. And I always appreciate the minds that you bring in this space as well. And it's nice to see some familiar faces. So as usual, when I listen to you speak, something strikes me. And I think that's because of the clarity that you lend to your work. But what struck me is that the substance is billed as a picture of decadence, which is also going back to Richard's comment about Dorian Gray, which I thought was nice because it's also a comment on hedonism. But what struck me just before I came to this talk and watched a bit of the film is how starving the characters are, and that the suffering is so destructive and so endless, because even the means that they acquire to end their cravings only intensify their cravings. That it's
Absolutely.
a profoundly false
Mm.
picture of hedonism. And while you were speaking, I remembered another film called Present Days. I think it's something like that, where it follows the story of someone who cleans toilets for a living, which is the opposite of what our usual picture of a fulfilling life is. But the character is so in tune with something that I think evades a lot of us, that you watch the film and a sense of tranquility falls over you, which is the opposite feeling that I got from watching
the
The
substance.
Substance. Yeah,
Yes.
filled with
Yes.
horror and anxiety and all the kinds of feelings that I don't want to have. But, and so I wonder about the role, not just of art to create convincing and true pictures of hedonism, but also philosophy. I mean, it's very useful to criticize the ways that we're going awry and the ways that we are falling apart or creating monsters. But I wonder about the role of philosophy as well to join in on that. What are true pictures of pleasure? And part of this comes from the kind of work that I do. Just as the last comment, which is a surprise to me, because I work as a counselor in the psychotherapy sense. And a lot of people will say, well, meaningly, I can't imagine doing the work that you kind of do because I would always be crying. And that's fine, that makes sense. But if I'm seeing people, 4 hours during the day and they're not talking about easy things that have happened to them, because I've been mentored very well, often when something good or something true or something courageous happens in the session, I'm more enlivened, not burdened. And I say to the listeners, was a big surprise. That is not something I expected. I fully went into this profession expecting to be for the opposite to happen. And so in a sense, I do it because it fulfills a kind of, it's a pleasure. And it's not because the right outcome is achieved, it's in the attempt. And the attempt is a very present focused. Anyway, so I've said a lot, but it would be lovely to hear comments about creating true pictures of pleasure and philosophy's role in that and what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot there, too much to chat about now, but certainly the hedonistic philosophies, the Epicurean philosophies are far, far, far different from the picture of the starvation for pleasure that you're seeing in the characters. So in a way, the movie is depicting a scenario where we've lost contact with what hedonism really is about. And I think you're absolutely right there. I don't think the ancient philosophers who proposed these hedonistic ways of life would be much different from the kinds of things that you're saying. So I want to say philosophy from, but I do agree with you that we've forgotten what it means as a kind of a general population, or the movies are depicting pleasure as something, as you say, something which we starving for, but it makes us hungrier. And we will never, ever, ever be fulfilled if we are striving for that kind of pleasure. And it's always a kind of the pleasure of, as Zizek would say, of power, of capacity to play a bit more. I mean, for Sue, it was what? It was just having a bit more sex with some dude. That's what she was quite willing to destroy her future being for. And yeah, I think that hedonism is actually a much harder work. It's not to do with basic pleasure. It's to do with joy. And that's something really different. So what is really interesting then, I think, as far as the movie goes and as far as the future goes, is that the starving striving to satisfy desires is a terror of moving into the future. It's actually a terror of the future. It's a terror of moving along towards a future in which you are older. So in a certain sense, you don't want there to be a future. It just has to be a pure present, but of a terrifying kind of, a pure present of starvation that feeds starvation. I love that image. I think that that's very useful. So that's the thing that tweaked my mind as you were talking, and I almost forgot about the rest. I'll have to go back to the video and kind of listen to it again. But yeah, I think we've still got some time. So thanks, Alex. That was really, really interesting and insightful. Taryn, I see you've put a comment on the chat. Would you like to just chat to it?
Sure. I guess what ended up striking me in what you were speaking about was slightly less on the substance parallel, but in some of the points being brought up by Zizek, and also the poignancy of looking at that book in the context of horizons. And when Prof. Nyoni started speaking about the linguistic attributes of these things and trying to like revisit how we're looking at things, and the parallel with someone standing at the top of the hill looking over a landscape and standing there alone, that's often what you might imagine when you're thinking of a horizon, is that this kind of humanist, I am looking over everything that something can be potentially made with, and this future of when we imagine it should be alive with hope and civilization and modernity and that kind of thinking. But it's like when this conversation gets distilled, it's thinking about the horizon less like we're standing on top of a hill and more as if accepting we are in a hole that has been dug, whether it's by us walking around in circles over and over, actions of one drilling too hard and others falling in, but we're not standing alone. We're standing in a group experience of humanity, of understanding that the problems of not having a clear horizon are universal. So we may have like our difficulties in coping with it in the different presentations of it, whether it's distracting ourselves or it's substance abuse, or it's freaking out about our own bodies, our own power, our own abilities with what's in front of us. But then the practical, more or political approach to it is to be thinking about how do we work together to see a horizon? How do we climb out of the hole? How do we accept that we are in the hole and what's productive with that? So yeah, that's what struck me as an interesting point in what seems so like something to really like bite into, that when we imagine a future, accepting that we're not waiting for something bad to happen, we're in the bad place.
Okay, excellent. Yes, yeah. Whew. Okay, I can see some interesting artworks coming out of you. Yeah, because if you're in a hole, you can't see a horizon. And I think in that sense, you are in complete agreement with Zizek. We have to act, he's saying, as if we are already in that hole. And we need to take some emergency, and that we're all in it. I mean, there's none of us that are able legitimately to take that Sarajevo subjectivity position of detachment where you are looking down upon humanity. I mean, everybody is in the same hole. I think it's an excellent metaphor. Another one that I think is very evocative and something worth thinking about. But we have to climb out. We have to work together to climb out. And will we? I mean, are we going to accept that, or are we just going to turn away and escape? I think and my feeling is that, yeah, I don't see us looking around at each other and saying, we're in this hole. How are we going to work together to get out of it? I'm very pessimistic about that. And maybe it's just old age, I'm not sure. But I'm hoping somebody can kind of, you know, offer a different kind of perspective on this. But I do think the whole is a very, yeah, useful and evocative metaphor. Thanks for that. Emma.
Oh, a sticker. Hello. How are you?
Good.
I'm really sorry I wasn't here right at the beginning. I had major technical issues. Typical. Thanks, Andrea. It's really good to be back and talking about these issues and thinking about things in a more creative way. I really appreciate the approach that this seminar series is taking this year. Just a couple of things that came to mind while you were talking, and I think it kind of reiterates a little bit of what Alex was saying. And that's, at one point you said living in the present is not a trivial act. So talking about the no future part of Zizek, meaning as in being more in the present as opposed to looking to some distant horizon and dealing with things as they are. And for me, you know, I'm all about this. And a lot of the ecological thinkers that I'm really interested in continuously talk about the value of the sensorial present, of being in the present moment. But I think something that gets lost with this is it sounds kind of like woo-woo, like it's a bit airy-fairy. But I think really an important aspect to remember is, from my own understanding at least, my own opinion, is that we recognize the benefits of being in the present moment and what that can enable, the space it can create. But being in the present is, or you know, presence is really about conscious attention to something. It's not passive. It's not about blocking out or shutting down or switching off, but being and sitting with exactly what is as it is. And we can talk about the whole and those kind of situations, but also one of the for me, the important things that I often forget about the present moment and the power of it is that it shows us reality is a terrible word to use in a philosophy seminar, I understand, but ecological reality only can show itself when you are paying conscious attention to what is, without distractions. And that also, talking on the linguistic front, involves perhaps actively, affirmatively trying to switch concepts for percepts sometimes, trying to ditch the language in the inner dialogue, whatever dialogue that is, in whatever culture you're in, and just being with what is, which is where ecological reality shows itself as a continuous unfolding of interconnective interdependence. And that kind of perspective is, a lot of people would say, is what's needed for a shift. But in order to get there, you have to kind of stop thinking and be with the present. So I think that's an incredibly important task. And it's something that we can all do and all engage with, but it's not going to lead to, it can't be with the intent for there to be a change. It'd be a bit like meditating in order to change yourself. Well, the whole point of meditation, you know, is to actually be with yourself as you are in that present moment, not to be actively changing. So with all that blurb, I guess what I'm trying to say, you'll hear more about this from me in a couple of weeks, is that being in the present is not a trivial thing. I'm going to reiterate your important point there. I'll stop.
Okay. No, I think you're right. There's something very necessary about being well in the present, regardless of what went before or will come after.
Yes. Yes.
And that being well in the present has got a better chance of enabling something what shall we say, something affirmative
Functional.
emerge, out, of it. But it doesn't have a complete chance of doing that. So you wouldn't be able to be well in the future with the intention of be well in the present with the intention of creating a good future. But it does open up more possibilities for a good future than, being starving and desiring to go back to what Alex was talking about in the future. So being Sue, for instance. So yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for that. I see that we are already, can you believe it, out of time. So I think unless you have a burning desire for a quick few minutes, Vulindlela, to chat to your comment. I see somebody's hearted it, so somebody loves it. So maybe we just, let's end on that. Let's see what you have to say.
I think it finishes off what Emma was saying, is that there's something about being in the present, and the adage I wrote there, someone, I can't remember who said, when we are in stasis, when we feel we're becoming stagnant or we feel insignificant or something, we tend to create problems for ourselves. We'll go looking for problems as a natural reaction in some ways. So it speaks again to that ecological space where nature, or at least the environment in which we live, doesn't seem to, let's say giraffe will pick at acacia trees in a certain area and won't say, let me try and eat a different type of tree today. Instead, it'll carry on eating the same tree, but it's not doing that out of simply not being conscious of the fact that it's eating the same tree. It's just saying, that's the tree I like, I'm going to stay with it. And just to reiterate what Emma is saying, is that being present doesn't mean you're not being explorative or enjoying or experiencing. It just means knowing that there's a flow through which I need to experience it in the here and now. I think if I'm hearing Emma correctly, and nature does that around us all the time. Whereas as humans, in our sentience, in our consciousness, we tend to think, well, these plants are growing out of control, I'm just going to cut them back. Yet really what they're doing is just they're growing and not necessarily doing something out of control. So I believe that Elizabeth had nothing wrong with her life until she saw or felt that she had something wrong with her life. And her projection of that was what led to the dark and horrific thing that happened to her. So she projected the horror, she projected the failure, she projected all of those things, but there was nothing wrong in terms of her perception if she had focused in the present and stayed with this natural state of being, I am. And that comes back to thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the thing that Elizabeth saw wrong was that she was moving into the future and she was getting older.
Pretty much.
Okay, with that, I think we definitely need to end this first off kickoff conversation. I'm hoping that a lot of these themes are going to come back again and again and again as the year progresses. Our next seminar will be by Gary Kokomur, and he's going to do, I can't remember the exact title, but it will be a seminar that looks at very concretely how artworks are imagining how we are going to live in the near future, like 2055. Are we going to be living on top of mountains or under the sea? Or how are we going to live? How are we going to be building our houses, given what we know is, well, listen to me, given what we think we know is predicted for the relatively near future. So that's going to be very interesting. So yes, hope to see you all here next week. And for now, lovely to see you all. Very glad to start the seminar again. And yeah, see you next week. Okay, bye.